for Daria.
All right, this is such a big room. Like, I don't know how to make my voice louder, but here we are. So I'm going to talk about server-side tracking in Next.js using Snowplow. So a little bit about me. I'm Daria. I work at Mavi Next. Probably most of you haven't heard about it, so it has nothing to do with Next.js, but we do use it. So because of what I do is so abstract, I kind of do a lot of crafting and like weird DIY stuff, because coding is like painful and sometimes you don't see the results. So recently I started like doing a cross stitch thing and doing a big mural of the Vienna U-Bahn, which looks like this. Yeah, but unfortunately back to business. So Mavi Next, where I work, is a venture builder. What it means is we have a bunch of different companies, different projects, Mavi Me, Mavi Work, Mavi Telemed, some people working on like ideation. It's an incubator, essentially. So the bottom line is everyone wants to launch their project. And that means, ads, right, usually. Lots of different ads. And ads are great, but, they usually come with some caveats. Like when you run an ad, you probably need to tell the ad source if that worked or not, so that it can learn on like your campaigns and stuff. So maybe a show of hands, who has had to install a metapixel on their website, or like any random arbitrary JavaScript that broke production afterwards? So who enjoyed that experience? And I think the core essence of that experience is somebody texting you, hey, here's the code snippet, can you please like put it in production? And I think the core is what comes after that, and all the things that happen or might not happen. So this notorious like script tag that generates sometimes stuff that you don't know what happens, and third-party libraries. It's a lot of work, but it lets your marketing team have some analytics, right? So my talk is about another approach to analytics and tracking and all of this story. So why not? There's not a right answer to actually anything, but in my experience, like why wouldn't you use third-party client-side tracking? Because that snippet you install, usually what it means, it fires events from the browser, from the client, essentially, right? So there are some reasons why you wouldn't do it. One big obvious one is privacy. Because essentially when you install that script, usually it drops a third-party cookie, and you don't have control over what you exactly share with the vendor. Like how many of you, another show of hands, how many of you have read the metapixel like code, like what it actually does? Like, or like even a little bit, like roughly, but it's executed on every request, right? And it's kind of scary if you think about it. I mean, sure, people maintain it, but yeah. So it's an all or nothing kind of situation. So when someone consents to marketing cookies, everything that the metapixel does will happen, and you can't say like, well, I don't want this type of event, and I don't want to track form submissions. Like it's an all or nothing situation. There are some sustainability concerns, right? Because like, do we really need this code to run in every visitor's browser? Like, maybe not for everything. So a quick refresher on how actually client-side tracking works. So someone visits your website, if it's a public website, and someone requests your web page essentially, and your server roughly responds with some HTML, which has this script tag with your metapixel installed there. So what the script actually does, because I read it for you, you don't have to read the code. I checked roughly what it does. The first thing it checks the Facebook pixel code. It checks whether you have the face FAQ cookie set, and it stores some consent, essentially parameters. So if you do have that cookie, if you have consented before, it will load the code from Meta, and then it will do stuff, like a lot of stuff. And actually, most of us like stop here, and it will track events, right, which can extend to anything, right? And there are use cases where if you're logged into Facebook in the same browser, theoretically, and you have a specific setup of the pixel, Meta will know your account. Like it will know what groups you follow on Facebook, and the ads will change like based on that, which you might not want, and you might not be aware of that. And all of this stuff, right? It happens in every visitor in their browser and every request. That's a lot. And it's controlled by third-party code that can change. So maybe sometimes it can not be the best. So an alternative to doing that, essentially feeding back the data into an ad provider, is one thing that I have come to use. It's called Snowplow. It's a custom code solution. Actually, it's customer data infrastructure. So a bunch of code that does several things. So stuff that it lets you do, it lets you collect, validate, enrich, and forward events. And these are software components you can self-host. So it's a bunch of stuff that you can do with Terraform. They have modules built and provided essentially. So the community edition, of course, there's always the start, right? It's a for-profit company, but there's a community edition which is almost open source, which I think is cool. So it doesn't cost you that much in time or in money, and maybe mental effort a little bit. But we will talk about it. So this is an eventing software, so it's meant to receive like events from from like analytics, essentially, for people doing stuff, and to receive around 100 events per second. If you run it on AWS, it's $200, which is not that much. It's a commercial setup. You can tweak the pipeline, like shut it down. You don't have to have everything up at the same time, and you can actually bring it down to very cheap for a cool project that you might want. So what does it consist of? So these are roughly the software components that you need for running this somewhat fancy setup. And the main thing is the collector. It's a collector app that you can send events to. Then the data pipeline looks super interesting. So after you collect, let's say, a page view event, you can then enrich that event. I'll talk about it a little bit later. Sometimes you can get a lot of stuff that you need for analytics without necessarily having to run client code, like device information. So there are custom enrichments you can enable. So basically transform your requests and store something about it. And then a bunch of stuff to load it into some storage of choice. This one is mostly on Google Cloud, this example. We use Google Cloud at work. You can also do Azure or AWS. This all kind of depends. But the talk was about Next.js, right? And front-end meetups and tracking, right? So how would you start using something like that in Next.js? So first, we're going to talk about the Node tracker library to do mostly server-side events. So you install that package, right? And then you initialize the tracker, essentially. Once you've deployed all the stuff, they actually updated to a new version, and the code is not verbose at all. In my opinion, it used to be a little bit more verbose. It's quite easy. So the tracker takes namespace. So we used to have like a separation between production and staging and dev in the namespace. It was like long production and so on. But then we started having separate instances of the whole pipeline. So that's not the case anymore. App ID is whatever websites you use. Say your blog. Endpoint is the collector URL, and then the buffer side is super interesting. So you might not need to fire every single event all the time. So you can decide to buffer every 100 events, just fire them like at once. Right, it also saves some cost. Right. So let's say you have a classic Next.js app, a blog app. Like, what would be the first thing that you would care about in a website? How many people are watching it, right? Like, is it relevant? Should I keep doing that? So the first thing that I would do is page view tracking. Now, so this library, the tracker, it does not require you to use TypeScript, obviously. And in the beginning, I didn't. And then I went through a lot of pain because of that. So I would highly recommend like setting types for your events. And I will talk about why later. So the page view tracking just takes super basic properties: page URL, page title, and refer. More or less is all you need to have a page view. And once you set up the type, you can set up a track page view function, essentially, that will call the tracker with your page view event. Very, very basic. So since we're doing server-side tracking, one of like documentation use cases for server-side tracking would be using middleware. Like what you might do is capture the request before it gets completely executed. It's just run some code before returning the response, right? And we can do that. So if you want to do something with every single request in Next.js, you can set up a middleware file in the root of your project called middleware.ts or JS. And disclaimer, like you have to be careful with that because middleware gets executed on every request. And if you do it in a like blocking way, or if you break something, like that might not be nice. So it's something to be careful with, but I think it can be a powerful tool. So middleware uses something called a matcher. So you can decide on which paths to execute that middleware. And so if, let's say we have a blog, right, you will have some API routes, like fetch blog posts or something that are not exposed to the public, right, that you will never call. Essentially, so we might not track page views on API calls. So in that case, we can say a matcher, let's only track page views to blog slash something. We can do that. And then essentially it's a function, middleware function, where before returning the response, you can track page view. And all you do is you get the page URL from the request. And in that case, right, because in our type, we said that the only thing we need about a page is a URL. Everything else is optional. We can decide to use or not use it. If there's a referrer, we can get the referrer. Right, so make sure I talk about that. So that's great. I mean, we probably all knew that. That's great, but what if we want to know more about who's browsing your website? What if you want to know their browser version, operating system, something else? Ideally, you can care about who's viewing your website and optimize the experience for them, right? And we can actually do that without client-side, without this third-party JavaScript code, without having to run anything in the browser with enrichments. So Snowplow provides a set of enrichments that I think are really cool and super useful. One of them that we use is the user agent parser. So remember user agent, this long string that you see while debugging and maybe logging the request. So there some great people made a parser for user agents that extracts this large string into usable groups of client information essentially. It's just a parser library, and Snowplow just uses that. So once you if you pass the user agent onto your pipeline, before being saved, it will run this code to look up the operating system family and so on, and you can save that without like having to log, having to run codes on the client. So how do we add the user agent? So there are some things for using this tool that you add on an event level. So like a page view has a URL and so on, and some stuff is common to a lot of events. So you would think maybe user agent, it might of course change, but it persists over sessions. So some stuff you set on an event level, and some stuff you can set on a tracker level. So user agent is one of those things that you set on a tracker level. So you can set it once, and maybe you don't have to keep passing the user agent every time, maybe before session expires. So I would set up a method to set all these properties that are not event specific. User agent is one of them. There are a bunch of others, so you can have that method and call that when needed. Now I know you're gonna ask me maybe, or look at this and like judge me, like why would you do that? Like do you really have to do that? In my opinion, yes. In my experience, I would do that because if you don't set a user agent proactively, it will be inherited from wherever that code is executed. So in our case, it was middleware, and if you don't do that, the user agent would be Next.js middleware, and that's fine. But like if you're then providing some reports to the end user of your software, and somebody wants to look, okay, like what are the operating systems? So the Next.js middleware is not very useful to someone who's looking like what kind of devices are visiting our website, and sometimes like you might ask yourself like where did that come from? It's not just with user agent; it's also like IP address. If you don't override it, and if you don't explicitly like not use it, it will be inherited from the server. So something like once we had, we forgot to do that, and then all requests suddenly were from Germany, where Google Cloud is, and we're like, oh my god, like what's going on? Like let's check it. So I would proactively just like set all the properties you don't want to use, or maybe you don't need to use for privacy, you don't have consent. I would just set them to null, and also it avoids like storage. If you know that it comes from middleware, you don't need to store that. There are a lot of other properties you can set. I mean, not many actually. So platform user ID, domain user ID, some pretty like basic stuff. Things that time zone, I haven't found like a use case for the IP address. Obviously, domain user ID and user ID like we use a lot. And I think it's interesting like that. In general, the exploration of your website can have many ends and many beginnings. And in our case, we have different types of apps, portal apps and public websites. You can log in on portals, and public websites you can just browse. So for public websites, I set a domain user ID, and once somebody registers, you can set a user ID, and then you can do all kinds of nice like analysis of, oh, how did this person like register? Like what were they browsing, and like at what point did they gain this user ID? So yeah, you can use all these properties. Right, back to the user agent. So if we want to have this client info parsing, it's quite easy to add that. Like again, we don't have to do it on every request, but we can call the method we set up, the set user properties, and pass on the user agent from the request. Right. So if it's undefined, then we'll call that empty string. And yeah, so before calling track the event, set some properties, and then track the actual event. There are a lot of other enrichments that Snowplow provides that I think are super cool. You can also write your own code. Like if you decide to do something else with your data, you can just write an enrichment, and before saving stuff to storage, essentially run something. Some that I think I would highlight, that really, this is somewhat long. There are caveats, some IP lookup, right? I mean, for that, of course, you need to have consented, like, do you really need the IP address? But sometimes it's nice, also, like, the IP address itself, it's personal data, right? And most of the time, actually, very often, I feel like we don't use the IP address raw. We're more interested in, like, where our users are located. So there's an IP lookup database, like, actually, MaxMind database, that you can use to extract like geo information from IP addresses, but you need to self-host it. So right, there are some caveats, but I think some stuff is really cool. So we also use, what else do we use? Campaign attribution is super useful. You know how, again, like when running ads, usually Meta will spin out a gigantic URL with UTM source, UTM campaign, and like Facebook click ID, and then you will log that because it's part of the URL, but it has a lot of UTM parameters. So the campaign attribution also parses them into nice categories that are actually useful, and you don't need to necessarily dig in Facebook for like this report and do all this groundwork. Yeah. So okay, so you wrote this code. You can also actually send events locally. And testing is super nice, and I would also recommend it. They provide a Docker image for a tiny mini version of the entire pipeline. So remember all these components like the collector, enrichment, and so on. You can run a small version of that locally, and all you do is Docker run and the rest. And then you send a page view instead of your collector IP, which would be on the server and receive events, and send it to localhost 1990. Then Micro will receive your event data, and in like console you'll have an event log, and it will tell you a few things. So it will tell you whether the event reason was valid, a little bit more about this later, and what schema Snowplow used for validation, and also the app ID, right? So they also have a great, nice UI. If you don't like reading logs, you can just look at a graph, and it will tell you which events like failed and which succeeded. And you can expand and look at the entire raw data of what you're sending, like what is the library attaching to the event, do you really need to save it, and so on. So here there will be an event ID, a timestamp, and so on, and you can really expand and look, okay, is user agent weird? Do I need to look at the IP address? So now a little bit about events, like in general, like we talk about this, like I think it's a native concept to analytics, but sometimes like it's easy to just say, oh, like the library will do something. And Snowplow makes you more mindful of like what you do with eventing. In my opinion, it made me a lot more mindful. There are two types of custom events that you can fire with Snowplow. One comes from their, so Snowplow, right, as a side note, it's everything with water. So there's like igloo and snow and like ice, I think, somewhere. So igloo is like, I don't know, they had a creative like branding team, and igloo, I guess, is like the house of schemas or something like that, so like central storage. They have a GitHub repo of all standard events that a lot of people worked on, like who work in e-commerce, and like some events are just standard, like link clicks, URI redirects. Sometimes they are specific to what you're using, to Google Analytics, like will want a specific type of event. There will be schemas for that. And you can also self-host your own registry, your own schema Igloo house, and then you create your own schemas, custom bundles. It can be useful sometimes. Like I think the most common use case for a custom event is an onboarding flow. Like you register and you have 7 steps, and you want to know like until which step people reach essentially. So you have 7 of these custom events, funnels, like whatever you want essentially. So how do you create a custom event? So how do these like schemas look in there? I think it might be too small, but I'll highlight some stuff. So let's make a schema for attending a meetup event, and all the schemas will just sit in text files essentially, where you describe the structure of data that you expect. So most importantly, it will have a vendor. Meetup.com is our vendor for this attend meetup schema. So vendor follows this reverse DNS nomenclature. It's who provided the schema. Super useful in an organizational setup. So if you have analytics and marketing, they have totally different events, and they want to know whose event broke like the pipeline, and then it's useful to know whether it was analytics or marketing. And then you describe the actual properties that you expect from the event. One important thing is every schema will expect whether you allow additional properties, right? So, and that's a little bit of a catch sometimes. So the pipeline expects events to be either valid or invalid. It's very non-forgiving, like, so there's no gray space for whether an event worked or not. And if you say my event can only have a name, the meetup can only have a name. A meetup actually can only have presenters, nothing else. A presenter can have only a name, only a bio, and only a topic. If you send an event with more than that, and you never allowed additional properties, it will fail, basically. So that's actually my TypeScript journey, right? So once I made a typo in one of the properties, and it wasn't right, it was just invalidated, and I was like, oh my god, like how could this have happened? Well, it's because I put any in the data, right? And if you allow additional properties, like if you just add other stuff, your events won't be discarded. Like for example, maybe you don't know the data structure like super rigidly right now, but something to be mindful of so that a bunch of events don't get invalidated. Server-side tracking, right? So some events are client only by nature, like of how they are. There's just stuff that doesn't fire a request to the server, like external links, clicks on external links, like on this Vercel portfolio starter. And even with the node tracker library, you can also do client-side events. You can call the collector from anywhere, essentially. It can be server to server. It can be completely server-side, but you can also do fire a call to the collector from a browser. So let's prepare some custom events tracking, and we want to track some external link clicks on your blog. So again, I would set up types. I have made so many mistakes with this, honestly. Really, like if I only knew what I know now, right? So every custom event will expect a schema, because the pipeline will want to validate your event and check if that was legit or not. And so every event expects a schema. So you can set up a type for a link click event. And so you can in the commercial version of Snowplow, you have a CLI to generate types from schemas, because it's a pretty one-to-one like ratio. If you describe the data structure, you can get types. But they're moving a little bit to profit, so it's not available for community. I post sometimes on the forum, and they said, yeah, sure, but like you can write it yourself. So I haven't wrote it myself yet. And I just use QuickType, QuickType.io, I think, to just generate those interfaces. Sometimes it doesn't happen that often. Yeah. So a link click would have a schema, and it can be only that schema because otherwise again it will fail. And a link click by Snowplow's custom event definition has a target URL, and that's the only thing that's required. That's what a link is. It leads you somewhere. It has some other properties which kind of let you find out where that link was clicked from. So target content ID classes. So here you can store the CSS classes you applied to your link, and maybe someone at Last Meetup pointed out super useful for having the same link in the footer and in the header, and you try to find out which one is more clicked and so on. But these are all optional. So I try to save in target what the link actually said, because sometimes it's also useful to just have the URL. If it was if it was an image, just what image it was. Yeah. So we can just actually set up maybe one function for tracking a self-describing event. Again, naming is difficult. It's very difficult to name things clearly. Snowplow used to call custom events, so events that are not just pages or just something. They used to call them structured, I think, and then there was a huge discussion of structured. It's actually not structured. It's unstructured, and it became unstructured data. And then people were like, well, it is structured after all. So the only thing that is true about this thing is that it has a schema. So let's say it's self-describing. So now they're called self-describing events because they have a schema that describes themselves, and it's huge headers on documentation. Sometimes we say this and that, but self-describing are custom events essentially. We can set up a wrapper function for all custom events, and for now we just have link clicks. So let's say we just have a link click, and we call the tracker with this build self-describing event. Yeah, right. So a page view, you could just call the tracker with track page view. A build self-describing event, you have to build the object first, and then you pass it to the tracker. This is actually interesting because I used to kind of disregard that, but it turns out that sometimes you need to do something with that object before tracking it. Yeah, and so when we add more events, I would just expand this to a union type and say our custom event can be either link click or URI redirect, something like this. So sure, it's a lot of work to set up types, I know, and we could also use the inbuilt types from the tracker library, or no types at all, right? So if you look at the Snowplow library itself, so the self-describing JSON, which is the parent type of the self-describing event, or not parent. If you look at the data object, so the actual stuff, the info about your event that the library expects, it's pretty loose, but so the data object needs to conform to the supplied schema. What it's saying is you can't just pass anything, it needs to follow the scheme. But then the type is obviously pretty loose, and it made me go like this a lot. But it has to be like this by design, because you can make your own custom events, right? And obviously they won't provide types for everything. But again, to avoid this and breaking in production, maybe write types for this, right? So it's kind of on you just to ensure type safety because of the nature of this stuff. So, right. So we built this wrapper method, and now we can, whenever we have a link, which will be client-side completely, but we can also do that. I would write a method handle link click, not to refer to all these types. I would abstract away from this and focus on okay, what does the link click actually contain in your application, the URL and what it was, and then just call the track self-describing event wrapper that we did. So when we do that, on this blog Vercel, right, there was a link to Vercel, and you send this event. This is the naming thing. So in the mini version of the pipeline, it will still be called unstruct event, so unstructured event. And also when you save it then to storage, all custom events will start with unstruct event vendor whatever, and then event name, and people will be a bit confused. So and I'll be what is unstruct? What is it? Where is timestamp? What is this? So this will be just prefixed to it. Yeah. And when you log custom event, you can inspect it in this micro version of the pipeline, and all we used was the URL and the element content, like what the link said deploy. It's too many slides away, I won't click through there. Right, and it will tell you no errors, so it passed validation, it was like a legit thing, and the pipeline said all good, saved it. I wish it did that when you log a good event and it's like, good job! It's okay, like you're probably not gonna break anything. Okay, you have your data flowing to some cloud destinations, and these events actually end up in sharded files, so Parquet files. I still don't know how to pronounce this, to be honest, correctly, if someone knows. Parquet? Not Parquet? Parquet? Parquet. So, sharded files are super optimal. Like you can't like really browse them per se yourself, so you wouldn't like end there. You would plug something into these files. So we, for example, we host the whole thing on Google Cloud, and we have BigQuery pointing to these Parquet files as an external table. So like we have Google Cloud Storage where the event data actually lays, and BigQuery is just pointing to it, like nothing is stored in it. It just is an interface that lets you do select whatever from. And to BigQuery, we can connect like a bunch of BI tools, Kibana self-service BI tools, whatever you want. But then we started with something like a little bit different, which was external destinations. Like the problem at hand was telling your end provider that the ad worked. That is also possible. So like now that you've tracked it, so they have something for that as well. They have a piece of software, and it's called the Snow Bridge. So it connects, snow to snow, I guess, like same stuff of the same stuff. So it's a lightweight tool for streaming data from some sources, some destinations. They support a lot of sources, also a lot of destinations. And the one that's kind of interesting and that lets you do anything you want with that request without even having to go through Parquet or Cloud Storage is that, HTTP destination. You can just run and call whatever you want with that event, essentially. So everything did, enrichments, like stuff like that, and you can just say, you know what, let me just send it somewhere else, like where I need to do that. And one integration that works very nicely is you send it to Google Tag Manager and you say, okay, here we are. We have ended our development journey and now marketing can take over, and they decide where events go and they send it to Meta and the original providers, basically. You can directly send it to Meta, obviously. Also, you don't have to use that tool. You can have a batch import into Meta, like you don't have to stream it if you don't need real time. But that's one integration that works really well. So there are downsides, obviously. The initial effort is kind of high. Depends on if you're doing it in an organization, you need to convince everyone that this is a good idea, and we need to now like write more code maybe, and we don't just install a snippet. So initial effort is kind of high. The event creation per se is dev dependent. So I haven't found a way to let like whoever is the consumer of like analytics create events on their own, like completely, like without dev involvement. So usually it's like a little bit annoying. It's like, you're creating a ticket for making an event is maybe overkill, but like it maybe will happen. So that's a big downside. One downside for me personally is that Snowplow is moving away from like true open source. So I mean, everyone needs to make money, right? And you have to draw the line somewhere. So about that, I had a lot of fun last year reading their terms of service and who could use it. And so in January 2024, if I remember correctly, before January 24, terms of service were pretty normal, like, right? So who can use it, who can use our open source version? Pretty much anyone, unless you plan to like make money off of our software. So if you build something else, like using that, and then you sell it, that's a no-go. But in January 2024, they added a super interesting clause, which is like, we have now another case, which is not okay for us, and they called it highly available production use. So to save you that, and actually I even like talked to some like doing licensing for like what that means. Does that mean that now I can't have a staging Snowplow and production Snowplow? Do I have to like, because in the beginning that's what I did namespace like _ staging production, because I thought, okay, maybe we can't do that. So it turns out, highly available production use is when you have multiple instances of some component running concurrently to like avoid loss. Essentially, one connector goes down, another one like is taking over in some kind of like protection infrastructure. So there is this limitation if you have an insane load of events where it needs to be super reliable and you want to run several instances of stuff concurrently to avoid that. You have to pay them, and you have to pay them a lot. So tools like this, I think they're great, but of course there's somewhere there are limitations. For most normal use cases, that are not like they don't have to be insanely reliable. Even there, you can do that with that one instance, but I would say that's fine. So there is someone made a fork, like a forever open source fork of Snowplow before they added this clause. And thanks to that person, like super great work they did. They didn't fork everything though, so not all components are on this. I don't remember actually what it's called. I need to look it up. But so not everything is available there, but you can also use that. Yeah. So that was my experience, and I made a repo with some of this code. You can look at it there, and you can also add me on LinkedIn. And thank you.
Are you happy to take questions? Or?
Yes, I'm very happy to take questions.
All right, then does anybody have questions? I have.
Yes.
Yeah, always. I'm curious.
Yes.
Did you measure did you have Google Tag Manager and external scripts before?
Yes.
Okay.
I can't give you stats, but yeah, it's different.
I wonder, did the stats change? Because, for example, I obviously use a browser with a lot of ad blocks,
right,
and so on. I'm wondering if the quality of the data actually got better by using tracking events that basically go to your own API, which would not be blocked.
Yes. So exactly that's exactly right, and
okay.
It did, and also obviously that it's different than sending it to an external thing. I mean, you cannot block them, but if you do it server side, of course. But we still try to do it, and it did improve definitely. But we still try to be kind of mindful of consent. So what I do, actually, it's kind of an interesting case because this Snowbridge, I should put a diagram here. But Snowbridge has a config, and you decide what you stream to Google Tag Manager. And we have several mono repos. Yay! Loves mono repos. But it's so. For example, one application has a portal and a public website, and so I'm able to stream both to Google Tag Manager. And it's in the config, it's a regex. Okay, this app ID and that app ID. And what I can also do is before streaming it, I can drop some properties. So what I do is for events without consent, I drop IP address. Nice. Essentially, because everything else is not personal information that we are tracking right now. So that's really cool because then it's 100% coverage of devices used on the stuff.
That's cool. Nice.
Certainly some effort, but yeah. Anyone else?
Anyone else? Questions? All right.
Okay.
Then I would say thank you very much.
Thank you.